Hello and welcome back. It is Monday. I am Mr. Sosotris. If you're in Canada, happy Victoria Day, and I hope you're enjoying your long weekend. This week I wanted to talk about kind of a complicated issue, being a critical thinker and an active critical reader of books. So social media, I think, has conditioned us to be very sort of rigid in the way that we view books. And there's a lot of people in the world who want to dictate what people can and can't read and ban books that don't line up with sort of the enforced ideology of the state. And that's kind of troubling to us all. So while there are books that contain problematic elements or like dark or troubling themes or whatnot, it's not the place of the state to sort of dictate what people are allowed to read. And so the way we get around that is people need to be sort of more active, critical readers of what kinds of books they read, both fiction and nonfiction. And instead of just accepting everything that they read as representing an absolute truth, because when you do that, you can see books that sort of contain elements that are problematic or disturbing or whatever, and you can say that this book is sort of morally wrong and that no one should read this book because it's bad. And that's a really simplistic way of looking at it. There's books that contain harmful views and portray negative things, but you need to kind of ask yourself, is this something that the characters believe or that, has to happen in the books for the characters to face trials or whatever, or is this something that the author is promoting? Because there is a difference. And so we shouldn't become sort of the mirror image of the book banners and say that, because this book contains problematic elements, it should be stricken from the shelves and no one should be allowed to ever read it because it's a morally evil book. We don't need to do that. Now, I tend to believe that people are kind of capable of making good decisions. Now, this might be a little fanciful, but so what I value is sort of education. Before you read a book, read up on the author, read up on not the reviews necessarily, because, if you don't want to avoid spoilers or anything, that's totally fine. But just do a little research before you read a book, get a sense of who the author is, what's going on, what kinds of things you might find in their books. Because there's some authors who are sort of problematic individuals, but their books don't reflect their real life kind of ideas. There's also some authors who seem fairly decent, but their books are sort of advocating for very harmful, dangerous ideologies or things. And so you need to kind of be aware of that. So a population who is educated and capable of critical thinking is going to be able to engage with the things that they read in a meaningful way, and they're going to be able to sort of evaluate them so that they don't just accept everything they read as representing sort of absolute reality. Now, it is a bit of a fanciful subject because I know education itself is kind of a fraught subject. Teachers are not paid very well, and there's certain schools that are given less funding than others because of the populations in that area, and it's a whole other kind of thing. But for the most part, I think the internet has allowed people to at least educate themselves about the things that they read. And I'm not saying that everyone needs to be sort of, an intense literary scholar and do deep dives of every single thing that they read, but people do need to be able to just be critical thinkers and know what that is and know how to kind of use it, because it'll help them sort of evaluate what they read, and it'll also help them to avoid misinformation. And so I have two examples here. One is a series of books and one is a single book, one fiction, one nonfiction, that sort of encourage readers to be critical thinkers and to actively engage with what they're reading. So my first example is the books of Tom Clancy. Now, I really, really like Tom Clancy. His books are like military thrillers, political thrillers, spy thrillers. They're really, really, really well done. And he's like not like one of my all-time favorite authors, but he's definitely a favorite. I have all of his books, and I genuinely really enjoy reading them. He has a way of sort of describing things in detail in a way that doesn't ever feel info-dumpy. And so he will go on deep dives as to like how the CIA works, or how certain military tactics work, or how certain political theater things play out, all that kind of stuff. It's very, very sort of technical, and he describes it really, really well. His protagonist in these books is called the Ryan verse, because it's all kind of takes place in the same universe, is Jack Ryan, and he's a fairly likable protagonist. He's a bit of a pretentious ass at times, but overall, like, these books are genuinely really entertaining. But all of these books exist in sort of a fictional Republican utopia that does not reflect reality whatsoever. So in this version of the world, like, there's no systemic prejudice whatsoever. There's no, like, racism or ableism. Everyone is sort of on equal footing. Certain minorities, like queer people, are just sort of a strange, very small minority that no one ever talks about unless they do something bad. The US has no issues with poverty whatsoever. Anyone who is in poverty is sort of, it's because of their own fault, and there's no systemic poverty issues whatsoever. The main character, Jack Ryan, he becomes a millionaire kind of on his own. He plays the stock market sort of early on, so he doesn't ever have to rely on sort of his job for his income. Or his wife is also a surgeon, but it's very clear that he's sort of like the American ideal of like the self-made man. You know, he doesn't have to rely on anyone else. There's also like a big stress on sort of traditional gender roles. Even though his wife is a surgeon and works full-time hours at the hospital, she still is the only one who cooks and cleans, and she comes home and like cooks dinner, and he's not allowed in the kitchen because, you know, they're very, very traditional. The characters in these books sort of worship at the altar of Ronald Reagan. The Protestant work ethic is very much a thing, and it sort of allows sort of successful, hardworking people to sort of look down on the poorer classes because they just don't have the drive that it takes to be successful, because America is prosperous and there's plenty of money to go around, and so anyone who isn't wealthy is just lazy, basically. So in the grand stage, everyone in the world sort of looks up to America as this paragon of virtue and order. Even sort of allies like Great Britain are portrayed as being just slightly backward. There's one book, Red Rabbit, where his wife is working at a hospital in England, and she's all frustrated because they have socialized healthcare, and all that does is it encourages people to be lazy and the quality of the services to be less, and everyone gets off on time instead of working really late hours like they do in America, because everyone in America is super hardworking, and that's better, and, you know, you shouldn't have to worry about things being expensive because everyone can afford medical care, and so any kind of, you know, you can invest in hospitals and stuff because the people will just pay for the services, and it's easy, and, you know, it just everything will kind of pay for itself, and so you don't have to have governments subsidized healthcare. So basically, like, in this, America is sort of the pinnacle of society. Everyone in America is prosperous. Everyone outside of America wants to be American. And, you know, there's a few issues here and there, but they're always sort of individual bad actors. There's no systemic issues whatsoever. Now, it's safe to say that I disagree with sort of Tom Clancy's overall worldview pretty much completely. There's also been a number of interviews with him, especially around 9/11. He was interviewed a lot. And so it's very clear that these aren't just sort of the ideas of the characters, these are the ideas of the author. And so very right-wing, kind of idealized version of things that does not reflect reality. Now, if someone asked me if I would recommend these, I would say that I do genuinely really enjoy his books, but he does have kind of a political slant towards the right wing. But you have to read these as fiction. And so he's, like, even though the political ideologies of these books are not reflective of reality at all, there's whole swaths of the population that he just sort of assumes doesn't exist. So I'd never suggest banning these books or keeping them out of libraries. Now, it's totally fine if it's just you're just not interested in reading that, because that's fair. It's, you know, it probably could rub a lot of people the wrong way. I grew up with these books, and so I really enjoy them, but also I appreciate how these books sort of challenge my own worldview, because you don't ever want your worldview to be something that just is like vibes only or like beliefs. You want it to be sort of based on, you know, what do you actually believe based on sort of what you see around you. And these books definitely challenge my own worldview because they present a version of the world that basically cannot exist and has not ever existed, but a lot of people believe existed. And so digging into sort of, when I'm reading these, one thing I do genuinely really enjoy is sort of picking them apart and picking apart how this sort of fantastical utopia version of America sort of can't exist and doesn't exist. And it's sort of a good brain challenge for me. I don't know if that sounds ridiculous, but it's a way that encourages me to be a more critical reader, because it presents a version of the world that does not fit with anything that I've observed around me. And so it forces me to sort of challenge my own assumptions and say, which of these beliefs that I have are beliefs and which are sort of rooted in reality. And I really like how these books sort of challenge that. Now, also, they are fiction, and I basically just read them as existing in a fantasy alternate history, basically. It does not reflect the reality, and you should not read these as reflecting the reality. But it is a nice, fantastical version of things that could have happened, and it would be nice if that was the case. If everyone was sort of taken care of and everyone was safe, and there really was a nation that you could live in where sort of everyone had equal opportunities and there was no systemic issues holding them back. That's a nice fantasy, and I think that's also part of why I enjoy these books, because it's escapist. So fiction is always a means of an author exploring the implications of either their own worldview or the prevailing worldview. There are some books that represent the author's accepted worldview, and the book sort of treats it as fact, and in those cases you have to sort of just engage with it in that sense and be like, does this make sense? There's also some books that challenge the existing worldview, and they're intentionally subversive, and that's great too, because it also gets people thinking about what are the things in the world around us that we could change? What are the things we could do better? What are the things that we need to try different options, that kind of thing. And so that's why fiction is important, because it allows authors to either challenge the existing worldview or to dig into it, and it also allows them to show different perspectives. Fiction is a really great way to sort of get inside the minds of other people, other cultures, other religions, all that kind of stuff. And so it's a good thing to read fiction that takes you outside your comfort zone. Now, I'm not saying that everyone should read this. I'm not saying that these are like the pinnacle of, perfect literature or anything like that. But I am saying that you need to be a critical reader, and a lot of people who read these books will read them and assume that they're presenting sort of the reality of what life was like in like the 80s and 90s. And they may just assume that this is sort of a perfect source for sort of how things should be, and they'll sort of internalize it. And that's a little bit more dangerous, because then your worldview is based on sort of a fantasy version of reality, and when it doesn't line up with the way things really are, then you're just kind of lost. And so it's a good idea to always, be aware these are fiction. These are not real. If the characters in these books did what they did in the real world, things would play out very, very differently, because the world is not as cut and dry as it is in this fictional world. But it's okay to read fiction. It's okay to take yourself out of sort of the real world. I'm not saying you need to read books that are sort of actively hateful or harmful in any way. There's books that I've read where the characters and the author seem to be advocating for quite horrifying things. And, I'm not saying that everyone should just read everything and accept everything and make excuses for it. That's not what I mean. What I mean is be an active reader and ask the question, or ask the text questions, and allow yourself to sort of question its worldview. That's either what the author intended, and in which case it's working because the book is causing you to ask questions about things, or it's challenging you by presenting something that you don't agree with, and you need to kind of understand why you don't agree with it. So the same thing sort of goes for nonfiction. And no nonfiction book is ever going to present sort of an absolute version of reality. It's really difficult to do that. Now, there are some really technical things that are a little bit more, unchanging. I'm thinking of when you're talking about sort of, astrophysics or something. Obviously, there's going to be new discoveries that are made that sort of add on to the existing body of knowledge. But for the most part, everything that you read, you need to be skeptical of, and you need to just not assume that any one book is going to encompass the absolute reality of anything in kind of a perfect way. Every book is going to be flawed, even if it's nonfiction. Now, that's not to say that there aren't just accepted facts that we all sort of understand, because scientists have proved them over and over and over again, and they're sort of accepted. Things like, vaccines prevent diseases. We know that that's true. The earth is round. We know that's true. That's not something that's going to be, changed by new discoveries made in the future. We do know that there are systemic forces harming minorities in many countries. That's not like a fictional thing. That's like, you can believe that there's systemic racism, or you can believe that there's ableism, but you don't, we haven't proved it yet. That's not true. And so when you're reading a nonfiction book, you need to be aware of the difference between the author's opinions and the facts, because the facts are facts, and that's accepted. But there's also going to be a lot of opinions, a lot of connections that are drawn between certain things that reflect the author's opinions or their interpretation of things, or one possible reading of certain things, and you need to be aware of that. So that takes me to my next example. This is a nonfiction example, and that is Howard Zinn's A People History of the United States. Now, I did a review of this one, and this one got sort of the most comments of any review I've ever done. Most of them were very angry comments. People were just like attacking Zinn for being sort of completely fictional and wrong and evil. One person said he was hateful. And so this is a really good example, because even though for the most part I really enjoyed this book and I appreciated what it was doing, you do not want to ever see this one book as reflecting absolute reality. This is a book that is meant to inspire conversations, but it is not a book that's meant to present a perfect, completely objective view of reality in a way that, there's no criticism that can be made of it. So one thing you need to know about history, especially, is every single history book is going to have an agenda of some kind. Every single book, even if it's just a list of names and dates, just like a straight chronology, the person who arranged that is going to have to make decisions on what events to include in that chronology and what events not to include in that chronology. And so by that very nature, there's always going to be an agenda of some kind. Every history book, every single one, is going to have an agenda. History is very impressionistic. So much of it is based in sort of how you interpret events. Because there's always going to be gaps in the historical record, and a lot of times writers of history have to either fill in those gaps with an educated guess based on sort of the information that they have, or they have to just say, we don't know what happens here. And both of those are valid. But that's not to say that every history book is flawed and you shouldn't read history ever, because if every history is going to be based on the agenda of the writer, then does that mean you should just never read history ever? And that's not true. You should read history. It's a great way to learn about things in the past so that we don't make the same mistakes over and over and over again. But you do need to understand how history works. No event in history happens in a vacuum. So there's a vast web of causality that surrounds every event. There's like political tensions, there's economic factors, there's the internal psychology of individual people, there's even like the pop culture of the day, there's the trends and styles of the day, and these things have a lot more of an effect on things than you would think. There's the famous example of how Jerry Ryan, who was hired to work on the show Star Trek Voyager as the character Seven of Nine, her being hired for that show directly led to a sequence of events that led to Barack Obama being elected to the Senate in Illinois. It's a long story, so definitely look it up. One actress being hired for a show led to another person getting elected for public office. So there's a lot of stuff that happens. History is never neat and tidy. So whenever you're reading history, one thing I'd always say is read whatever books strike your fancy about whatever historical period that you're interested in, but also read other books on the same subject. You don't ever want to put your entire historical knowledge in the hands of one book. Even if you agree with the book, even if you really like how it presents things, even if it seems logical, you do want to read other accounts of the same thing, because your understanding of history is going to be kind of like a collection of overlays. And so no one book is going to give you the whole picture. You need to read multiple books on the same subject so that you can sort of accumulate an image, overall of the time period that you're interested in, and you'll have kind of a more firmer grasp on a lot of the different stuff happening, because different authors are going to focus on different things in that time period. Now, considering this book, the author specifically focuses on sort of oppressed minorities in America's history and the things that happened that kept them down, the things that they did to fight back against those forces, and the effects of those conflicts, basically. Now, each chapter of this book could easily be a single book on its own. And so one valid criticism is that because he's covering such a long period of time, from like the 1600s to the present day, he has to sort of race through quite a lot of history. And so any one chapter of this could have been its own book. And so if you're going to race through everything, it's going to be, by its very nature, it's going to be superficial. And so when you're reading this, you want to use it as a jumping off point, not as an end point. This book is more about including talk of minorities that were either excluded regularly from the school curriculum or from kind of popular historical textbooks, or talking about minorities that are misrepresented in sort of accepted, popular historical understanding. It's meant to encourage readers to do deep dives into each of these subjects kind of on their own, but it's meant to give them an introduction to a lot of these things. So one example would be sort of the worker revolts in the turn of the century, in the early 20th century. A lot of those, we know that they happened, and there was a lot of them, and they led to a couple different things, but they led to sort of a lot of the accepted sort of things that we take for granted today. Things like the 8-hour workday or the 40-hour work week, things like breaks and, paid time off, all that kind of stuff. It also is what led to sort of the anti-union sentiment, because the unions got very powerful, and the unions were often associated with sort of communist leaders, which got fairly popular at the time and created a lot of really positive change, but they also made a lot of enemies. And so in the years after that, there was this sense that they needed to sort of squash unions and keep them from getting powerful enough to sort of rise up again, while keeping things fairly decent for people. But this is not an exhaustive history of that time period. There's a lot of stuff that the author can't go into detail about, and there's a lot of stuff that he either glosses over or maybe has to include a couple sort of leaps in logic that sort of cover up more complicated things that he wouldn't have had time to dig into in here. So it's a simplified version of history. The broad strokes are true. The overall events that he's talking about are true, and he includes sources that you can verify yourself. He includes testimonies from people who lived in that time period. And so he presents sort of the facts, but there's always going to be more nuance to any of the situations that he's describing. And so to get that nuance, you need to read other books on the subjects. He includes other sources you can look into so that you can read into more detail about these topics. But you shouldn't see this as presenting sort of everything as it absolutely was for real. It's more presenting, these are the overall conflicts that took place. Here's some examples of what people said about those conflicts, but there's more to learn about each of these things, and so you can do that kind of on your own because it's covering a very, very long time period. People who criticize this book tend to sort of misinterpret the negative reviews. The negative reviews often are from historians who say that he relies too much on sort of emotional arguments, which is fair. They call it like an appeal to pathos, because that's the thing that sort of grabs the general everyday person the most. If you look at advertising, if you look at commercials, the commercials that catch you or catch your attention the most are ones that appeal to an emotion. If they make you laugh or they look cool or something, they're always going to appeal to emotion. Very few commercials are going to convince people with just straight facts. If there was a commercial that was just a chart of why this car is more safe than this car, it wouldn't grab anyone's attention. It has to use appeals to emotion to get people interested. And so popular writing like this, which is meant to sort of take dense historical subjects and make it accessible to the everyday person, is going to appeal to emotion. And so in historical circles, if you're writing like a historical book, like if you're like a professional, like you have a degree in history, there's going to be sort of less appeals to emotion than you would normally find, because they want to focus on just the facts and not dressing it up in any way, because they don't want to appear that they're promoting an agenda of any kind, even though every historical book is going to have an agenda. But this book sort of wears its heart on its sleeve, and it's very much about getting people emotionally invested in real conflicts that happened so that they care about the historical events. And so it's more his approach that a lot of people criticize. And also because it's covering so long a period of time, it can be superficial at times. In the back of the book, he does describe how there's certain sort of eras in history that he was less familiar with, and so he didn't go into as much of a deep dive into those parts because he didn't want to misrepresent them. For example, he talks about how he isn't that familiar with sort of the gay rights movement, and so he does touch on it, but he doesn't go into very much depth, and so it's a very superficial kind of thing. It's not incorrect, it just isn't presented with the level of nuance that would be needed to accurately give someone a good view of sort of what that event was like. So he's not making up facts at all. He's presenting things in a sort of easy to digest way that would appeal to the most people, to get them aware of real events that happened. And so his historical methods aren't necessarily as rigorous as someone who maybe teaches history at a university, but it's a way to get people invested in the historical record so that they can then seek out more information about those topics on their own. There's a well-known takedown of this book by Dr. Mary Grabar. She's a member of sort of a right-wing think tank, and this book sort of threatens their sort of simplistic view of American history. A view that would make Tom Clancy himself very happy, because it was sort of, America has no problems, America's never struggled with racism or poverty or anything, and everything in this is just designed to make people hate America, and so because of that this book is evil. This person also did a takedown of the 6019 Project, saying that it was just stirring up anger against America, even though what it was talking about were very real things that Black people faced in American history that needed to be discussed. But so a lot of the pushback against this book are sort of emotional reactions where they say, clearly this author hates America, and he thinks that everyone who likes America is a bad person, and they get really, really emotional about sort of what it's talking about. And that's not what it is about. I'm not even American. I live in Canada. But I really like American history because there's a lot of stuff in there that I think we can learn from. And this book is just talking about sort of, these are the overall big conflicts that shaped American history that people don't really want to talk about because it makes them uncomfortable. And I think that's why this book is valuable. The purpose of the book is not to give a deep dive into every single period of American history. To do that would be like, you could do that for 100 volumes and still have things you hadn't talked about. But the purpose of it is to get people invested in the lives of people who history has not usually deemed to be that important. Because most histories focus on the leaders, the most rich people, the people who are most influential to sort of the politics and the overall sweep of things. And they don't often talk about sort of the everyday people, the everyday workers, the everyday, the underclass that often isn't very well represented. And that's what this book is about. It's about drawing your attention to people that history doesn't usually talk about. And so even though he rushes through a lot of things and he has to sometimes sort of gloss over certain things because he doesn't have time to get into the deep nuances of what it is, the purpose of it is to say, hey, this is what Jim Crow was like overall, and it was bad. This is what slavery was like, and it was bad. This is what the worker revolts were like. This is what the Great Depression was like for, an everyday person living there. And it's just to start conversations and to get people thinking about things. And so this is another book that you really have to read with a critical eye, and you have to engage with it on that level. If you accept it as seeking to present absolute truth, and this is the only thing that matters, and this is the only history of the United States that you need to read, you're gonna misinterpret what it's saying, and you're not going to get anything meaningful out of it. So you have to be a critical reader, read other histories of the United States, read other perspectives, and from reading all those different things, you can sort of you can create a composite image of what United States history is that, is a little more accurate. And that's the purpose of the book. It's to get people reading other things. So even if you agree with a book's sort of political leanings or even the author's sort of agenda, even if you agree with it, don't put all your stock in one book only. You have to be able to actively engage with the things that you read so that you can sort of come to your own conclusions, but also not to dismiss facts. So anytime you're going to have a history book or a science book or anything, there's going to be a mix of facts and sort of interpretation, okay? And so you need to be aware of the difference between facts and interpretation. And just because you disagree with an author's interpretation of certain things, which is fair, because different authors are going to have different interpretations of different historical things, that doesn't mean that the facts then are all fake and that you should discount all of them. So you need to be aware of the difference between facts and beliefs so that when you're reading something, you can say, okay, this is a fact because we have a record of this event happening. For example, the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory. It's a very well documented event. It did happen. It was a watershed event in terms of workers' safety, and the working conditions needed to be overhauled. We know that fire happened. We know that many people died. There's a famous poem that's written about it. There's news articles. We know that did happen. So that's not a thing that's fake. But different authors of historical nonfiction are going to maybe give that event different levels of importance. Some might say that it was a watershed event, that was a big galvanizing thing that changed people's opinions. Others are going to say it was one event, but it was also combined with many other things that happened that are going to sort of convince people. And so in that case, different interpretations are going to use the event in different ways, but the facts itself, the thing that happened, did happen. So that's a real thing that happened, and you need to be aware of when someone's talking about their opinions about its importance, because that's going to be interpretation, rather than just saying, well, if I disagree with their interpretation of the event, then that just means that the event didn't happen and that it's all fake, and that's not true. Critical thinking is important because it encourages you to be skeptical and it protects you against misinformation. There is a lot of misinformation, especially now with social media. There's a lot of stuff that seems completely accurate, especially if it's something that you agree with. Someone can just throw up statistics and it's just like a meme, and it's like there's no source given or anything, but if you believe it, then you say, yes, that's true. So be skeptical and don't just get all your sources from one thing. You need to ask questions, but you need to work on those critical thinking skills and to tell the difference between facts and opinions. And also, what are good sources and what are shaky sources that you can't really rely on. You need to be aware of how facts can be doctored. One thing you see a lot is graphs, and it's very easy to make sort of a slight spike in a line graph look really drastic if you change the units on the side. So you can, be aware of those kinds of things. That doesn't mean that all history is fake and that everyone's lying to you. Be aware that just you need to ask questions and don't accept anything as absolute, perfect, completely reliable. If you simplify books down to just pure evil or pure good, you're going to really limit your worldview. You're going to limit the things that you're exposed to. It's always important to expose yourself to different ideas, different worldviews. If you're reading fiction, read fantasy that's set in a world that's based on the mythology of cultures you're not really familiar with. Or if you're reading romance, read a romance between two people that have very different situations from your own. If you're reading historical fiction, read books set in countries that you're not very familiar with. Expose yourself to different things. Now, one thing I do want to say, because there's always going to be nuance, is that you don't need to force yourself to read things that are hateful or that are like personally triggering to you or which are advocating for anything dangerous. I'm not saying you need to go out and read white supremacist screeds just because you need to, get the whole picture. That's not what I mean at all. There are, opinions that are not worth listening to because they're kind of useless opinions. But I am saying that you do need to challenge yourself and ask questions of the things that you read. If you're going to read a book, look up the author really quick and just see what's going on with them. It's do a little bit of research. I'm not saying spoil yourself on the book, but just be aware of what you're interacting with and try not to internalize anything as representing sort of the absolute truth that you need to then incorporate into your own worldview. Because fiction is fiction, and even if you agree with it, you run the risk of sort of falling into simplistic ways of thinking. And that's what critical thinking is meant to avoid, is you don't want your worldview to be a simplistic one of just pure right, pure evil, and everyone who reads that book is a bad person. For example, there's people who would say that anyone who reads Tom Clancy is an evil, bad person because his books represent a Republican worldview that is not indicative of reality. There's people who say that people who watch The West Wing are evil because The West Wing also presents a fantasy version of America that is based on liberal ideals, and it's very idealized and it doesn't represent absolute reality. But again, that's something else that's designed to get people to think about things. So challenge yourself, read things from different perspectives, read authors from cultural backgrounds that are different from yours, read books that make you think. And if you just want to read things that are fun, that's totally fine too, but read fun books that aren't always just people who look exactly like you all the time. Challenge yourself a little bit. There's tons of amazing authors out there, fiction and nonfiction, and I think your brain will be healthier and you'll be less susceptible to misinformation if you have sort of more broad, open-minded worldview. So with that said, I will let you go. I will see you next week. And in the meantime, happy reading. Bye.